Litigation that has surrounded the overcrowding in California's prisons for years, even decades, is finally reaching its climax. Recently, a panel of 3 federal judges has ordered that the state reduce its prison population by the end of January about 8% or else. With the threat of early releases or the prospect of spending hundreds of millions of more dollars to house state inmates before the governor, the legislature, and law enforcement, the question of prison overcrowding is now front and center at the state capitol. How do we get to this point, and what are the short and long-term solutions to California's chronic prison overcrowding? We'll ask Drew Soderberg, the California Legislative Analyst Office expert on prison issues, and Dan Morain, senior editor at the Sacramento Bee. California's Prisoner's Dilemma.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The overcrowding in California prisons has been an ongoing issue spanning decades. Faced with an increasingly impatient federal court panel, the heat is on the governor and the legislature to provide what the court called a, quote, durable solution to this decades-old problem. Our first guest is Drew Soderberg, who is an expert in prison issues with the California Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report. I understand also you did a recent report called Addressing the Federal Court Prison Population Cap, so hopefully you can give us some of the information from that report. So why don't you help our audience with the state prison population problem? What's going on there?
Well, essentially what happened is in 2009, a federal 3-judge panel found that the state was unable to provide a constitutional level of health care to its inmates given the current level of overcrowding. At that point, the federal courts ordered the state to reduce its prison population to about 137.5% of design capacity.
So my recollection is reading your report, you were saying that initially we were 200% over capacity. They brought it down to only 148% of capacity, but the court wants it at 137% of capacity, correct?
That's correct.
So in 2011, Governor Brown attempted to address this problem with something called realignment. What is realignment, and how much did it reduce California's prison population?
So essentially, the 2011 realignment was a series of bills, most notably AB 109, that shifted responsibility for certain offenders from the state to local government. Now, it was intended to reduce the prison population, and the way it did that was essentially by requiring that after October 2011, certain offenders could no longer be placed in prison, instead had to remain under county jurisdiction. Now, since the law was passed, the state's prison population has gone down by about 24,000 inmates, or about 17%.
Quite substantial.
It is a substantial change.
You know, it's interesting in terms of art, it's called a state prison, but a county jail.
That's correct.
And I think people sometimes just kind of mix those terms together, but they're really different. In 2013, the administration notified the federal court that it wouldn't be able to meet its imposed cap, down to 110,000 state prisoners. What did the court say about that?
So essentially what the court did is it ordered the state to start taking action to bring it into compliance. And what the court did is it ordered the state to house more offenders in fire camps, because offenders that are in fire camps aren't counted towards the prison population limit. Similarly, it ordered the state to maintain its out-of-state contracts, because again, those offenders aren't counted towards the limit. And finally, it ordered the state to take various actions that would result in the early release of about 6,000 offenders.
So the governor responded to the court. What do you think about his response? Was it a good short-term and long-term solution?
Well, essentially what the governor did, he first appealed, but then when the appeal wasn't successful, the governor asked the legislature for about $315 million to purchase about 12,500 contract beds.
And that's in 1 year?
That's correct. That's correct. And now the strength of the plan is that it would theoretically result in compliance if we were able to activate those beds in time. The drawback is that it was really only a short-term solution, because those contracts were set to expire and the prison population was growing.
Wasn't he also talking about another $400 million in years 2 and 3?
That's correct. So the plan envisioned that the state would continue to maintain these contracts over a period of time, and that was the amount of funding that they thought would be necessary. Specifically, they thought about $315 million in the first year and $400 million in the second year. Now, they did have a plan to bring forward to the legislature some options that could result in long-term compliance other than just contracting. But they weren't specific on what those options would be, and those options wouldn't be presented to the legislature until the contracts were about set to expire. So it wouldn't give the legislature a lot of time to react to the proposals.
So the Republicans in the legislature and the Assembly Democrats agreed with the governor, but the Senate Democrats had a different idea. What was their idea?
That's right. So essentially what the Senate's response was to try to enter into negotiations with the plaintiffs. Their plan assumed that the state would sit down with the plaintiffs and negotiate for more time to comply with the limit and potentially adjusting what that limit was. The plan also contained a provision that the state would set up a grant program to incentivize counties to reduce the number of offenders they send to state prison.
Okay, so you guys had, the LAO's office, had recommendations about what the state might do to meet its short and long-term obligations in terms of reducing overcrowding in prisons. What were they?
Well, at this point, our office hasn't come down specifically on what we recommend the state should do, but we have said that there are various options that the state should consider. One of the options is reducing recidivism. So reducing the number of people that return to prison after getting released.
And that number I read somewhere is about 70%?
That's correct. It depends on how you measure it, but it's around 65 to 70% depending on how recidivism is measured. The other options that the state has is to consider additional contract capacity or making changes in sentencing law to reduce the size of the prison population.
Well, that's a very factual background on the prison problem. I want to thank Drew Soderberg. I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier, from the Legislative Analyst Office. When we come back, how do the politics of prison overcrowding play in the state capitol? We'll hear from veteran political observer Dan Morain of the Sacramento Bee. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now joined by Dan Morain, senior editor at the Sacramento Bee and longtime observer of state politics, to discuss one of the top political issues this year, the ongoing federal lawsuit over overcrowding in California prisons. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Well, recently the governor and the Senate pro tem reached an agreement to address the prison population issue. What was that agreement?
Well, it started out with the governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, the Senate Minority Leader, and the Assembly Minority Leader all getting together in a big press conference with lots of law enforcement behind them and announcing a big settlement. Well, there was a big missing link, and that was President pro tem Darrell Steinberg, who was adamantly opposed to this proposal that the governor had come up with. So they fought for a couple weeks. They were back and forth, but they ended up settling, and Steinberg gave some. I think the governor gave less than what Steinberg did.
So
there's going to be a little bit more money for mental health care,
Okay.
which is what Steinberg wanted, a little bit more money for rehabilitation, but there's still going to be about $300 million for additional bed space in the state of California.
So the governor presented that agreement to a three-judge federal panel overseeing the prison
Right.
overcrowding litigation, and he asked basically for a 3-year phase-in period. How did the panel rule?
Well, he didn't get it. He's just not winning before the federal courts here. So
He got a little something.
He got 1 month. You know, that's a 1 month stay of execution, and then he's got to figure out. He's got to come up with a plan for reducing crowding. Now, he doesn't have to release inmates, and he's vowed he's not going to do that. And so his solution is going to be to buy more bed space.
So we're talking about 10,000 inmates, correct?
That's 9,000 is what they need.
Okay, yeah, because that number
Yeah.
seems to fluctuate a little bit.
Yeah.
But one possible solution that was floated by the governor was to send several thousand of those prisoners out of state. The three-judge panel didn't like that idea, and they said, stop.
Right.
Don't do any more of that until you work something out. But doesn't that pretty much limit the governor in terms of what he can do?
There's not a lot the governor can do. So the solution, his solution, and the solution of Jeffrey Beard, the Secretary of the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, is to buy bed space in private prisons. So part of that's going to entail having to bring these private prisons up to state code. So it's not an inexpensive solution, but that's their main solution at this point.
And who would be the guards at those private prisons? Would they be public employees or private employees?
Well, that's the thing. The benefit, to the extent that there is a benefit in using private prisons, is that they're lower costs. And the reason they're lower costs, or one of the reasons, is that labor costs are far lower. Well, California's deal is that the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, which represents prison officers, is going to staff these prisons. So whatever cost savings there might have been is out the window. We're going to be paying. We're going to be paying to upgrade these facilities, and we're going to be paying state labor costs, which are higher than private guards.
What about reducing sentences for minor crimes? Is that an option?
Well, the governor is convinced that it is not an option. He's done it already. He feels as if he has reduced prison population as much as he can reduce it safely. I mean, think about when Schwarzenegger was governor, not very long ago, there were 176,000 inmates in California state prisons. Now there are 119,000. That is a massive drop. That's on historic levels.
But they're not releasing these prisoners. These prisoners are going to county jails.
Some are out on the streets. Some are in county jails. They're not getting released out the back door. They have served their time, and they're out. And then there have been changes in the law that allow the state to not bring them back into prison. And so many of them go into county jail. Many of them are on the street.
You know, some charge that there's still lots of elderly and disabled inmates that could be released that pose no threat to society. The administration says, no, that's not true. All these low-risk prisoners have already been released or sent to county jails during realignment. Who's right?
Well, you know, that's a great question. And you know, I've done enough crime stories over the years. I've done enough stories about parolees who have committed really bad things. You know, my bias is generally that the people who are running the prisons probably have a better idea about who is safe to be released and who is not. Now, you know, are there some people among that 119,000 who could be fine on the outside? No doubt there are.
It's just not.
Do you want to pick them? I'm not going to pick them. You know, somebody who knows a lot more about criminal justice than I know has to make that decision.
Yeah, and we're talking 10,000 people. Okay,
Right.
so when we come back, we're going to talk about whether a solution can be found in negotiations instead of litigation. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Dan Morain, senior editor with the Sacramento Bee. You know, part of the ruling the federal judges had was they ordered the state officials to confer with inmate lawyers to try to work something out. Do you think there's any possible solution that's going to be found between those two groups?
Well, you know, that's certainly what Darrell Steinberg had envisioned. He had envisioned that Jerry Brown would sit down with plaintiffs' lawyers and work this out. I don't think Jerry Brown wants to do that much. At some point, there's going to have to be a settlement. Otherwise, this is going to go on and on and on and on. But I don't see it happening.
What's the reason? What's the reason for that? What do you think?
Well, you know, I think no governor is used to being told what to do, especially by judges. So, you know, so I think the governor is a little bit stubborn here. I mean,
Is there a trust issue here as well?
Well, he's been working on this lawsuit since he was Attorney General, right? So this goes back 7 years. He's been enmeshed in this case. He's had multiple press conferences where he's come out and harangued, just gone after the plaintiffs' lawyers here, the inmates' lawyers. You know, I think the inmates' lawyers are sort of rightly a little skeptical that he's willing to deal. So I think this goes on for a little bit longer.
You know, it seems like everybody agrees that rehabilitation is a good idea. So let's say there is no agreement between the inmate lawyers and the governor, but the state puts substantial resources behind a rehabilitation effort. Do you think that's going to sway the federal court to grant an extension, or are they going to say, no, you still need to reduce your prison population?
No, the court is adamant. The court wants that percentage down. They want crowding down. The court is convinced that the state cannot provide health care, mental health care to the level that it thinks is necessary, is constitutional, at its current level of crowding. So you know, the state can spend, and I think does spend money on rehabilitation, but it's not going to be enough.
That carrot just won't be big enough?
I just don't think it will be. It hasn't been yet. And the state has spent billions trying to comply with this lawsuit. I mean, billions. They've built entire new wings of prisons. I was at San Quentin 3 weeks ago, and I saw the facade of the new prison hospital there. It's an incredible edifice.
Mm-hmm.
Not cheap. There's a new prison hospital over in Stockton. These are big facilities.
It sounds like you've kind of got a situation where you have this unstoppable force and this immovable object. The federal judges nor governors want to be told what to do, and so they're both kind of digging in their heels, it sounds like a little bit.
Yeah, well, and these judges have been around for a long time. Thelton Henderson, Lawrence Carlton, and Stephen Reinhart. They go back a long ways, and they've seen a lot, and they're not easily swayed.
Well, okay, so the governor has appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn that three-judge order on the 9,600 inmates. What are the odds that the Supreme Court are going to rule in the governor's favor?
Well, Justice Kennedy, Anthony Kennedy, is the only Californian on the court. He wrote the decision that led to this new order, this latest order. I just don't see him changing his mind. I mean, he wrote a very strong opinion back in 2010. Was appalled by what he had learned about the California prison system. Now, much of it's out of date, but still, I think he's going to leave it in the hands of these three judges.
Even though it's a fairly conservative U.S. Supreme Court.
It is a conservative Supreme Court, and Anthony Kennedy is nobody's liberal, and Reinhart, Henderson, and Carlton are quite liberal. But no, I think he's just decided that this is not something that he's going to get back in the middle of. Even though there are members of the court who would like to get in the middle of it, I don't think they've got the votes.
It's interesting. This isn't the only current litigation on prisoners in California. There was a trial going on in Sacramento regarding the use of force. There was also a recent Federal Court of Appeals decision rebuking California for failing to protect disabled inmates. So he seems to have a lot of litigation in the state around the state's prison system. And folks may be wondering, who's the problem here? Is it the state? Is it the inmates and their lawyers? Is it the courts?
Well, inmates have time on their hands. They've got not a lot to do. Many of them are perfectly smart enough to read a law book and know that they can file a habeas corpus petition. Inmates, lawyers, this is their stock and trade. They make money off this. They care about it. I've never met a prisoner's rights lawyer who wasn't a true believer, but it's also their living. And the state and the person of Jerry Brown, pretty stubborn.
Okay, well, when we come back, we're going to talk about, if there are any, solutions to California's prisoner's dilemma. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking about realignment with Dan Morain of the Sacramento Bee. That issue is kind of an important issue. It reduced the prison population substantially, but people don't really know whether or not it's working. In fact, the state auditor, Elaine Howe, recently released a report which states, quote, "The state does not currently have access to reliable and meaningful data concerning realignment. As a result, the impact of realignment cannot be fully evaluated at this time. Even so, initial data indicate that local jails may not have adequate capacity and services to handle the influx of inmates caused by realignment." And she basically says she considers this a high-risk situation. What are your thoughts on realignment?
Well, I think she was absolutely right. There is a real lack of data. So one of the things that those of us who are trying to pay attention to realignment have to deal in is anecdotes, and people who tell the stories often are often telling them through their own political prism. So we're sort of at a loss. We don't know what the true statistics are. Now, I do know that the Public Policy Institute of California has started gathering the data, getting it finally from the California Attorney General's office and from other sources. And so in next year, we ought to start getting a picture, a glimpse of how it's working.
She's calling it a high-risk issue. Does that mean this is the next place where we're going to see litigation?
Well, we're already seeing it. So even if the governor settles this lawsuit involving healthcare and mental health care in the state prison system, prisoners' rights attorneys already have filed lawsuits against Fresno County, I believe Monterey County. There are lawsuits out there over county jail conditions. And as you know, these are the places that house many, many, many of the most mentally ill people in the state of California, the county jails.
And county jails really weren't designed for long holds, right?
No,
I mean, they were supposed to go to state prisons.
They weren't. And now we've got the phenomenon under realignment of essentially prison-type sentences, multiple years, people doing those sentences in county jails. Absolutely, this is the new frontier in prison litigation.
You hear a lot about the costs of housing inmates. Talk a lot about the state spends more on prisons than they do on universities. What's driving those costs? Is it long sentences? Is it prisoner health care? Is it guard pay?
Well, I think it's all of the above. Health care is a huge driver. It has been for years. I started writing about this in a serious way in the 1990s, and health care was going up at a geometric level, and it still is. So, I mean, that's a big driver. These are not the healthiest people.
What do you think the short and long-term solutions are to this problem?
I'm not sure what the short-term solution is. I think ultimately what the state is going to have to grapple with is its sentencing structure. When Jerry Brown was governor the first time, he changed the sentencing system from indeterminate sentences to determinate sentences. So you get a fixed sentence for a fixed crime.
So the judge doesn't have a lot of flexibility to take other things into consideration.
Very little flexibility, and the parole boards don't have any flexibility. So, somebody's sentenced to 10, 12, 15 years, they're going to do the bulk of that time. Now, under indeterminate sentencing, some people got out who never should have gotten out, but at least it did give some flexibility to parole boards for people who reformed themselves in prison. There's not that flexibility. So I think at some point, and I hope it's soon, the state convenes a sentencing panel, really smart people on it, judges, criminologists, people who truly understand the system, and start taking a look at the sentences top to bottom.
What about recidivism? I mean, the prisoners that return to prison, there's a very high rate, 65, 70% go back to jail.
Sure.
What's a way to stop that revolving door?
Well, who knows? If we could solve that, we would solve so much of the problem.
Well, some people say rehabilitation
works. Yeah, some people just aren't able to be rehabilitated. I mean, it's a big problem. One of the things that we have to pay attention to is when we as a state and as a society say something, we ought to mean it. So a sentence that is life in prison without parole needs to be life in prison without parole. The flip side is that we ought to at least, I think, give the possibility that some people can be rehabilitated and maybe get out before they're 80 years old.
Well, let me ask you this one last question. The PPIC came out with a poll recently and said that 52% of the respondents said violence and street crimes are not much of an issue in their community. In addition, 55% of likely voters said their local government was doing enough to reduce crime. Only 39% said it wasn't. So is crime becoming less important of a hot-button political issue?
It is until you get mugged. I think or until your car gets broken into or your car gets stolen, then it becomes a very big issue. But on a broader level, all we need is one polyclass, one Richard Allen Davis getting out of prison on parole and kidnapping a beautiful young girl and
changes everything.
And then it's front page news.
Oh, there you go. Well, I want to thank Dan Morain from the Sacramento Bee, also Drew Soderberg with the California Legislative Analyst for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
Realignment has clearly reduced overcrowding in the prison system, although the population level has not yet reached the target still required by federal court order. However, simply sentencing low-level felons to jail rather than prison will not provide a long-term solution. Many jails were struggling with overcrowding even before realignment began, and jails are not typically designed to provide in-depth rehabilitation programs because they were not expected to house long-stay inmates. However, another important component to realignment is the opportunity for counties to make greater use of community-based sentences for low-level felons, sometimes using a combined custodial and community sentence. Studies show that community corrections can be effective at reducing reoffending, especially when offenders are engaged in programs that address substance abuse issues and mental health needs. This does not mean that all programs will work for all offenders, and careful evaluation of these programs is needed in order to find out which are effective and which are not. This is all part of the so-called evidence-based practice that is at the forefront of community corrections today. Significantly, recent state legislation increases funding for such community programs in an effort to find a long-term solution to prison overcrowding. The research evidence suggests that this could be a promising course of action, assuming that programs are implemented properly. Another important benefit would be the reduction in costs. Effective use of community-based programs could play a vital role as California and the 58 counties seek long-term solutions to the prison and jail dilemma. For the Maddy Report, I'm Emma Hughes.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.